In this first video, we're going to talk about Neolithic architecture. And the reason we're going to start with Neolithic architecture is because it is the first architecture. It was the first recognized architecture. There may be architecture out there that ceased to exist that we were doing, which is likely. We're probably doing things with sticks and leaves that have since been eroded and moved. However, these are the first more permanent residences that humans built. And they were more than just shelters. And that's why I use the term architecture rather than Neolithic huts or Neolithic shelter. There was a intended design behind what they were doing. So, if I can get to the next slide, I will. There we go. Okay, so this is what we call the birth or the advent of architecture, because what happened was that humans invented agriculture. And when you grow your own crops, you don't have to travel, so you can begin to have possessions. And then once you have possessions, you need somewhere to store them to keep them from being, destroyed by the elements. And while you're at it, why not have a nice, safe place to sleep? And that's what began to happen. Humans initially, first shelters we sought tended to be caves. And this is one where we inhabited caves, this cave 12,000 years ago. So according to the science, humans emerged about 350 to 200,000 years ago, and then began to inhabit caves 30,000 years ago, maybe sooner. I mean, it's always hard to say. Archaeologists look for remains to be able to say for certain. And often remains get carried away or scattered or broken or dissolved. And so we have looked a little bit about cave art. And that's how we knew that humans were living in caves, because we found remains of it. And then this about 11,000 years ago, we started building. That's when agriculture happened. So for most of our existence, humans have lived in nature, lived out in the wild. And if you think about that, it will help you start to understand some of the ways of thinking. One of the ones that comes to mind is tribalistic thinking, right? We still tend to think tribalistically rather than globally, even though we do live locally, but we do so in a global society now. But we still tend to be very tribalistic. And back then, tribalism was a survival trait. Now it causes people to fight over whether they're on the red team or the blue team. And so this is a site in Turkey from 11,000 years ago. Jericho was initially habited almost 11,000 years ago. And here are some of the archaeological ruins or remains from that site. Of course, current city back here, modern city. Another site in Turkey from almost 10,000 years ago. And so you can see the materials, right? The materials were natural materials. They were stone. They were, in this case, they actually carved down. Okay, so you can see out here, they actually carved down into the ground, because if you think about Turkey, it's hot in the summer or in the sun and during the day. And so by carving down into the ground where the air stays a current 50 something degrees, 54 to 56 degrees, you had your own natural air conditioning. This is a reconstruction, but this is typical, right? We didn't have technology beyond some stone tools, right? That's what Neolithic meant. It wasn't so much a period as it really just was a time when humans were using stones as tools. And so while we could, had some things we could do, for the most part, you see this was thatch and wood and reed, bamboo. We also used stone, obviously, stacked stone, slabs of stone. What am I forgetting? Mud, a lot of mud. I'll show you a little bit more about that. And then in the United Kingdom, roughly 5,500 to 7,000 years ago, there are multiple sites that um, that humans began to build, and we're going to look at a couple of them. So the Stone Age started with farming, ended when metal tools became widespread. So once we started using metal tools, that was the end of the Stone Age. And obviously everybody's favorite Stone Age family there. And most people are familiar with Stonehenge. It is probably the most famous Neolithic building. It was a site for, well, we're not exactly sure. But it was a site, this ring, this outer ring here, actually was a burial site. So this may have been a cemetery. But also what happened was during the solstice, you can see the sun cuts through this. So they designed this as possibly a chronological clock, or it was possibly just a remembrance for those who had died. We're not sure because Neolithic peoples did not leave behind written language for us to interpret beyond what they painted on cave walls. Ceramic was something they started using in some of their designs. Anytime you visit relics, anything that is wood has been recreated just because it would have all been rotten and destroyed by now. But the stones are still the original. How do you think they did that? Well, I've heard they built a big sand pit, got the stone up there by pulling it, and then removed the sand. And same thing with these giant, massive stones. These are massive, very, very heavy. That they would build a structure that they could erect it into place using physics, and then they would remove the structure. Wattle and daub were basically this mud and thatch or reeds. And here's just some terminology that is associated with stone that we still use today. For instance, we still use ashlar masonry as a term today, where you lay stones in horizontal courses and we use mortar. And so you all will have access to these so you can go back through them a little bit more slowly and read further about the terminology. And that is a cyclopean stone, just very, very large. Yeah, quarry faced is still a term. Masonry means all stone products. And it is pronounced masonry. I've heard people call it masonry, and you will be mocked behind your back if you do that. So I'm just letting you know. It's masonry. Masonry. And concrete, by the way, while we're talking about it. Right now, masonry includes concrete. We're not at concrete yet. That hasn't been invented. But concrete and cement are two different things. Cement is glue, and cement is in concrete. It's the glue that holds the aggregate together so that it can harden and become concrete. I just did it. So it's concrete block, not cement block. I know it's a hard habit to break, but if you're in the industry, you want to make sure you're using the lingo properly. So I'm going to try wherever I can come up with them is to make sure I explain what the correct terminology is so you'll understand it. More terms. Okay, so let's look at a couple of these. Knap of Howard. These are the ruins of an original residence. And you can see the thatch is missing on the roof. And this is probably one of the oldest preserved stone houses in Northern Europe. Um, and it's just two rooms, and you could get through the from one to the other. So this is where we start, living room, living space, and private bedroom space, or a workshop. Just don't know how they used it. And you can see some remnants from, they had a stove. It's pretty cool. And they're zoomed out. This was obviously added later, and all the walkways were added later so that people could see inside. Because quite often, you want to protect yourself from the elements. And you can imagine the breeze coming off the ocean, because this is on the ocean, could wreck your roof. Okay, so Newgrange, while it is not residential in terms of people living there, it is a ceremonial place. So technically, it's kind of a residence for the dead. And it was constructed about 5,200 years ago, which makes it older than Stonehenge and all the Great Pyramids of Giza. Yet most people have never heard of it. And you can see this was just stacked stone, and they embedded these beautiful round stones in it. So it creates that gorgeous pattern. They also began to carve intricate designs, right? So we're going from shelters that are minimal and not really given a tremendous amount of design thought to more artistic in design. So that's why I use the term Neolithic architecture. This is intentional design. This is architecture. They were architecture in the sense that they were master builders. They were building something, and it was intentional. It had purpose, and they wanted it to look good. And you don't do this otherwise. And so they also did something else that was intentional. On a certain time of the year, there's a roof box, and I'll go back and show it to you. Because you never see it until after you know it's there, where the sun comes through and lights up this inner chamber. I'll show you where that is. It's right here. That box is right there. And so the sun comes through, and it hits, and it illuminates the inside. And I've been in it. I didn't know it existed. I had studied architecture. A friend of mine knew about it, said he wanted to go, and we went, and we're surprised to find out that, this predates the pyramids of Giza. But that is intentional design. This is done without power tools. Very, very impressive. So that is the beginning. This is where we started. It's interesting that we did this in the Neolithic period, obviously, because we were using stones for tools. We were also using stones to build our residences. And so that's it. That's the beginning. And we're going to move on to Egypt in our next virtual field trip. Hope you enjoyed visiting the Stone Age, and I'll see you in the next video.